Hi, you might remember me from some of the YouTube videos I've been putting up. Mostly I do music, but today I'm going to be a cook. I'm not really a cook, I'm a baker. I like to make things that taste sweet and nice, cakes, that sort of stuff. And today I'm doing one called spiced apple cake, and I'll show you also the vegan option for this one as well. Don't let the spice bit worry you too much, because the spice is cinnamon. But the recipe comes from a time from my Aunty Beryl when people didn't have much spice at all in their food, so anything with a little bit of spice was quite exotic. For this one, the ingredients you'll need probably 4 or 5 apples depending on the size, but you can do more because they can always freeze. And peel and cut your apples. It doesn't really matter what sort of apples you have. The green or red apples are both fine. The green ones sometimes put a little bit of a tang in it. And so what I do first of all is start those stewing with a little bit of water on the stove. And we want to get them soft, but not really soggy soft. We don't mush them up. We leave them. I use a little device that looks a bit like this, which is an apple corer, and cuts them into eighths as well. But if you don't have one of those, you can do it like a caveman and use a knife. Here's some apples I prepared earlier. I haven't cooked them yet, I've just cut them up. And just to show you how easy the gadget is, I'll have to drop the camera down to show you. If I drop the camera down here on the table, so we've got that in shot at the moment. No, not quite. Okay, now we're in shot. So this little gadget here, I'll just push that through, bang, and all your pieces drop out the bottom and the core is left to throw away. Okay, so I'll get those on the stove and let you know what else you need. You also will need a cup and a half of flour, self-raising flour, sorry. Now if you want to make it gluten-free, there are gluten-free options available. Here's one here, a major supplier one, gluten-free. Probably comes in backwards on the camera. And if you're making it for a vegan, or even if you just don't want to use your eggs, you can use, we need 1 egg for the recipe, or a tablespoon of flax. And we'll also need cinnamon, just a teaspoon of that, some cocoa. I've got all my ingredients out beforehand because I'm told that's the best way to do it. And we'll need some sugar. Doesn't particularly matter what type of sugar you use. I usually use raw sugar. And later on, when you want to ice it, you'll need some icing. So we'll get that underway and I'll come back with the next step. My apologies, you'll also need 4 ounces or the equivalent. 4 ounces equivalent is about 115 grams of butter. If you want to make it for a vegan, you can use a butter alternative such as Nuttalex. And that works fine, tastes exactly the same. And so you probably need teaspoon measurements, cup and a half, half cup measurements. And I use a springform tin just because I find it a lot easier. This one's a 7.5 inch springform tin, and I just line that with some baking powder to make sure it doesn't stick when I put the base in of the cake. Okay, I'll get those apples on. Okay, while those apples are cooking, we add our 115 grams or 4 ounces of butter, or for the vegans, or for cooking for vegans, alternative with Nuttalex or something. We add the butter, the sugar, the cocoa, the cinnamon, and the flour. And again, you can use the self-raising flour. You can use a gluten-free one if you're preparing for people that like their food gluten-free. And so you rub those in together. I'm having a go at that now, rubbing that in the mixing bowl. I did forget to mention, actually, you'll probably need 1 or 2 lemons for mixing the icing. This cake has a lemon icing as opposed to water or butter icing. So you use the lemon juice to make up the icing. Okay. So we end up with a dough that looks a bit like that. This one's still a little bit wet, so I could sort of put a little bit more flour in that, but we still haven't put the egg in, which will actually make it a little bit wetter. So egg, or for the vegans, flaxseed. And so for the flaxseed, we take the equivalent of one egg is 1 tablespoon of flaxseed. Pop that in there. And 3 tablespoons of water. Well, I've put 2 tablespoons here because I actually prefer to do slightly differently, and add a tablespoon of olive oil as well, just to keep the whole thing a little bit moist. It hasn't seemed to have had any bad effects by doing that, and of course the olive oil is fine for the vegans too. Put that in there. So we just need to stir that, and it should come a little bit like a paste. So it goes a little bit like that, like a paste. And we pop that in, but I don't think I'll keep doing this with my hands. I'll use a wooden spoon now because I don't really like the feel of egg or flaxseed and olive oil on my hands. So I'll mix it with a wooden spoon. So this is our dough with the egg or the flaxseed mixed in. It's a little bit moist to touch, but it's not sticking to my fingers. But I'm going to put that onto a lightly floured table top down here. There we are. We'll put that down and we'll sort of get a little bit of that moisture out of it. And what we need to do with this is we need to make it into 2 halves, because we need a top and a bottom for the cake. But before you do that, I've just put my oven on. You might like to do the same. 180 degrees or 350 I think is the equivalent in Fahrenheit. Just check that for me. And so what we're going to need to make is not quite 2 halves, because probably the bottom one's a little bit more than the top one, because you need to do the sides a little bit. So I'll cut that sort of roughly there, so that we'll have a bit more than half for the base and a little bit less for the top. So we kind of work that into around into a roughly round shape. If you've got a rolling pin, you can use that. Otherwise, you can just do it with your hands. It's fine. And it's quite forgiving in the tin, the bottom in particular. Top so not so much so. But in the bottom, you can get something roughly round, and put it into your tin. Okay, that's sort of nowhere near the shape of the tin. So what I'll do here is I'll push it out to the sides. I'll just push it out to the sides and up the side of the tin. Trying to keep it roughly the same diameter through the cake. But it's fine if it's a little bit homemade-ish. So I'll push that all out to the sides, so it starts to go up the top. Up the sides I mean, not the top. So now I have my base pushed down to the sides of the cake, and just giving a little lip on the sides, as you can see, maybe. Not sure if the camera's picking it up. It's got a little lip around the side, so that when the apple goes into that, at the moment the apple's probably too hot to put in there. We'll wait till that cools a little bit and we'll pop the apple in there. In the meantime though, you can work on the top of it. So the other half of the pastry, the other half of the dough rather, to make a top. So we've got that here, ready to go. Sometimes it gets a little bit temperamental and falls apart, but you can usually sort of fix that up on top of the cake as well. So our apples look a bit like this. As you can see, they're still a bit too warm to put in. You can probably see the steam coming off there. But we can drain them. That's another thing we can do. We don't want the water in there. We can drain them. Okay, we've put the apples inside the base we've prepared. Nice and generous. You can see that they're in good chunks, so I haven't mushed them up at all, because you want them to sort of stay fairly solid to keep the cake together. And then we put on the top. Okay, when you put the top on, you might find, like I've done here, that there's a tiny little bit of the apple that's not covered. Don't worry too much, because we're going to ice the cake when it's cooked, so some of those sins will be covered up. So I'll pop that into the oven. And I'll come back a little bit later to see how it's turned out. Okay, the cake has been in the oven for 45 minutes. Let's take a look. It should be right. It seems to take a little longer with the vegan flour. I guess it's a rice maize flour. But that's what it looks like at this stage. No icing on yet, but I'll leave that on the wire rack to cool. It says it's risen quite a bit in the tin, and we'll come back and ice it later. Probably most of you know that a cake's done when it springs back. When you touch it, and it sort of springs back, but you probably know that. So this is what the cake looks like with the icing on. I often grab a little bit more cinnamon at this point while the icing's still wet. I just sprinkle a little bit over just for the effect of it. And we'll just let that cool there, and we'll be ready to eat that. Okay, so that's the spiced apple cake, and that's the vegan and gluten-free version of it. Hope you've enjoyed that.